Welcome. I'm Glen Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glen's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program. This month's interview on Glen's Parallax Perspectives will help us think about democracy more profoundly and more creatively and more boldly than we're used to doing. Instead of narrowly electing one person or another, how could we devise a more profound kind of democracy in which all people have real voices and real power? How could we eliminate the corruption caused by big businesses and rich people, extremely rich people, and political parties? And how could we empower real people instead of just having a political class that is over us as overlords? One knowledgeable guest here is with us during this hour, help us explore the topic. I'm happy to welcome Nick Coccoma. Nick has researched these issues extensively. He's researched the problems and some exciting positive solutions. And it'll be fun to hear what Nick has to say about this for our audience here. I've heard him do 2 one-hour presentations about this for another group that I'm connected with. I invited him to be a guest on the program, and so here he is. We'll make it happen here. As you know, if you watched the programs before in my series, I like to help our people see things in totally fresh ways instead of just the narrow tunnel vision, and we certainly will do that here. Nick Coccoma is a writer and an ambassador for Democracy by Lottery. His academic background focused on philosophy and theology. He's worked in several areas, including teaching, campus ministry, and nonprofit organizations. Nick is a freelance writer who has been published in several good publications. He also publishes a newsletter on Substack called The Similitude. And at the end of the TV program, in the closing credits, I'll give you a link to that. And he writes there on culture, politics, and religion. Welcome, Nick. I'm glad you're here. We will have a good time, and the people watching this will have a good time too, because it's like, wow, I never would have thought of that before. So let's get rolling with this. When I introduced the program here, I invited us to think about democracy more boldly, more profoundly, and more creatively than we do now. And I like what G.K. Chesterton said: all real democracy is an attempt to bring the shy people out. And that quotation, which you provided for me in advance, gives an insight into where this TV interview is headed. Let's summarize for our TV viewers an overview of what we'll discuss during this hour of interview. Can you summarize the problems and then the bold solutions you're proposing? And then we'll flesh these out during the hour interview, especially focusing on really getting clear about these exciting solutions. When I work on any issue, Nick, I like to start the people that I'm working with by helping us ground ourselves in our best values. And I appreciate the image that you showed on the screen, identifying village values of unity, citizenship, and the common good. And these good values are relevant to our conversation here. Can you show us that image on the screen and tell us how you see these values as grounding ourselves to work on an open democracy?
Sure, Glenn. Well, it's great to be here. And let me pull up that image for us. So my presentation's on democracy by lottery, past, present, and future of democracy. And I had that quote from Chesterton that you so helpfully read for the audience. It's a wonderful quote. And as you said, I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, a village really. And like the saying goes, it takes a village. Well, that was true for me. And where I grew up, our village was animated by several values. Those are unity, citizenship, and the common good. And this animated the community that I was part of. There wasn't a lot of polarization. Everyone tried to do their best to make the village work. We had one school, we had to plow the streets, we had to take care of everyday issues and problems. And we were trying to find a way to do that in the spirit of civility and of neighborliness and communitarian values. And that has shaped me to this day.
Uh-huh. Well, and we'll see how that plays out during this interview. In this country, almost all Americans think democracy means elections and two big political parties. And I don't buy into that concept of democracy. I think we can do a lot better than that. Nick, can you show us some images on the screen? Help us understand the problems. And then after a few minutes of that, we'll get into some solutions. So show us some images in your presentation here.
Certainly. So when I was 10 years old, my father ran for judge in upstate New York. And so I got my first taste of electoral politics at the tender age of 10. At that time, it was an exciting experience for me. But later I decided that if I wanted to try my hand at politics, the best way to be to run for student council president. Well, that was an education of altogether different sort, because I found out something that all of us learned in high school, which is that elections are primarily popularity contests. And it, in my case, became a three-way battle between myself, my best friend at the time, and another person. And it was really about which of us could sell ourselves to our classmates and trade on our popularity among the student body. And I think we unfortunately see that this is what's plagues our elections on a state and national level out in the real world. Often our elections are just about who's more electable and who you like more. And on top of that, there are so many other pathologies that plague our system. The media manipulates elections so much. The influence of social media especially has become very pernicious. And the electoral system divides us into competing tribes. So we have this growing sense of polarization along these kind of tribal lines where we're encouraged to be cheerleaders for our tribe and to hate the other tribe. And there's no incentive to try to find common ground, to come to the middle, to moderate our views, and to see our political opponents as fellow citizens and human beings. We're encouraged really to despise them. We also see a lot of corruption in our electoral process. We have dark money just flooding the system. We have lobbyists who give lots of money to buy off the votes of our elected politicians. Elections are sometimes stolen outright. I was just reading about Lyndon Johnson. He famously stole an election for state senate in Texas in the 1940s. Very brazen corruption. And then along with that, we have lots of evidence that our elections have been captured by elites. That it's really a few 100,000 people are the main donors for electoral campaigns, the national level. And this really has an outsized influence on our system. And then rounding out all of these problems is this increasing sense, especially in the last 6 years or so, that our campaigns have become an unending reality TV circus. And that's just left most of the population totally exhausted and disillusioned.
Right. Yeah, I think probably everybody can identify with those. We're so saturated with those kinds of toxic, cynical abuses. People say they support democracy, but actually the United States has a republic in which we elect people to make governmental decisions for us. If we had a real democracy, we'd be able to make decisions ourselves. Instead, we elect a political class and we have a republic. And the interview here we'll do now provide some fresh information and insights to help us make the transition from republic to a really profound democracy in which people really are empowered to run our society. Can you show us, Nick, on the screen, any other problems or see, is there anything else on this, or do we move on to a different?
Well, you put your finger on the problem, which is that we elect representatives to our legislative bodies. And, you know, when I was younger, I had this fantasy that our electoral chamber, our legislative bodies were very sacred halls where great deliberation was taken on the issues of the day, and that our representatives carried themselves with great decorum and with a profound sense of responsibility to find the best policies for guiding our country and our communities. But the reality, as we now see more and more, is that our legislative bodies look more like this. Politicians behaving very badly, slinging mud at each other, fighting with each other. They tend to kowtow to their party leadership, and they vilify the other side. They go on media junkets to score points against the other team while boosting their own team's image and their own personal career without much care for the common good or what's really best for the country, for the American people.
Yeah. So even if it's not an actual fist fight like what we see on the screen here, they're doing that with words, with power plays behind the scenes, behind closed doors stuff, and the ordinary people get squeezed out of that. We don't have a voice in that. They're doing it behind closed doors, and they're fighting it out. It's just a power grab.
It feels like a game, like they're just playing games, and the rest of us are all getting hurt in the process.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it makes us feel like we're perpetually at war, that there are these two giant teams fighting each other. The famous quote from von Clausewitz is, "War is politics by other means." Well, often it feels that politics are war by other means. And that, again, is just leaving us feeling like we're constantly shouting at each other from opposing sides, and that there are extremists on either end of the political spectrum who dominate what passes for debate, and they're just unhinged, and they are not acting in good faith, and the rest of us are caught in the middle. And
if we had a real debate about the issues, people would say, well, here's the way I see it, and here are the facts that support my position. And somebody else will say, well, I see it this way. Here's what I propose based on these facts. And we would have it argued out in a rational way. Instead, it's name calling and all that other crap.
Exactly. And that's because the electoral system does not incentivize finding common ground or even acknowledging that the other side has a good point, or maybe did something that was actually a good idea, or had a success somewhere. It's all about demonization and polarization. And the social media, of course, has just made this all the worse.
Yeah. It's megaphones for all that vitriol.
So what we hear more from local governments is then the sense from people that there's been a breakdown in trust. Everyone's suspicious of each other and of the government. Very few people are at the table when it comes to making decisions. And it seems to be the same people, the same voices over and over again, who are loudly saying the same things. And it just leads to the sense that everything is hard and our systems aren't really working. We're divided against each other. We aren't solving these very difficult intractable problems, and we all just feel angry and that life is awful, and that this decision making is very difficult and leads to a lot of disenchantment and apathy.
Right. So what happens that we all keep seeing is this politician says bad things about that politician, and vice versa. This party says bad things about that, and the problem is not, oh, let's replace that bad politician with a good politician, because the problem is systemic. It's in the system, how the system functions. And we're taping this now in early May of 2023, and I've seen recent public opinion polls saying that the voters, looking ahead to the 2024 November election, a majority of voters do not want Biden to be reelected. A majority of voters do not want Trump to be elected. And yet both political parties are absolutely, at this point in May 2023, both political parties are absolutely hell-bent to be absolutely loyal to their party's frontrunner, supposed frontrunner, who is actually opposed by a big majority of the public. And the public doesn't matter. It's the parties running this thing. The problem is systemic, and we're not going to solve the problems by replacing Trump with Biden or Biden with Trump or whatever. We have to work at the system level. And I appreciate that's how you are looking at this.
That's right. And we see this reflected in polling. So the satisfaction with our system is at a low for Americans. Only 45% of the country, as we see here, are satisfied with our system. It's far below that of Germany and even Britain.
Yeah.
And
we have a low voter turnout. Very few Americans vote in elections compared to, there are many other nations where like 80% of the people, in some nations 90% or more of the people vote. And here people say, why bother? The system is rigged. My voice doesn't matter.
That's right. And they say that political discussions today are just too rude and disrespectful. So you see here, 88% think that our political discussions are rude and disrespectful, that politicians should be more civil. And a similar numbers think that too few people get involved in the community locally, and that people with extreme views are getting too much attention in public life, and that we need to have people with more reasonable views. Yeah. So there's overwhelming dissatisfaction with the system. And we see here that most Americans, 67%, think that our politicians, our career politicians, are corrupt and don't care about what everyday people think. And this is among the highest of liberal governments in the Western world. Only the French are slightly more disillusioned when it comes to whether our politicians care about everyday people.
Yeah.
People are afraid this is just only going to get worse. You see here a plurality of Americans. This is from a Democracy Monitor report from Public Agenda. 44% think that it's only going to get worse in the next few years, not going to get better. So there's a sense of real disillusionment with our current system. And I think the core problem of all is that we just don't see ourselves in what we have right now in our electoral system, what we call democracy. We look at our Congress, our state legislatures, our elected leaders, and they don't look like us. They don't come from the same backgrounds, the same careers, the same places in life as most everyday Americans. Most of the members of Congress are men overwhelmingly. They are white. They are very old. Most of them are lawyers, or some are businessmen. And overwhelmingly, half of the members of Congress are millionaires. The other half are close to being millionaires. This is profoundly not a representative body when it comes to reflecting the actual community, the actual American citizens.
Yeah, we just don't have people who are working in an industrial plant, or a grocery store checkout line worker, or somebody who, barbers, or washing dishes in a restaurant. Those people are not elected to Congress or state legislatures or even city councils. It's those elite occupation and elite wealth thing, but almost zero out of the kinds of jobs that the vast majority of people have.
That's right. And most members of Congress, just about all of them, have graduated from college. Only 35% of the American people have done so, have gone to college. So you have a big gap there in terms of levels of education. And that changes your perspective on things. The same with, yes, incomes. We have 40 million poor Americans, but you're not going to find a poor person in the halls of power. So working people, everyday Americans, look at our representatives and don't see themselves. And that leads to a profound sense of alienation, a gap between our government and us, the people, we the people. And that increases the sense that the government doesn't really work for everyday people. It works for a tiny 1% or even less than that of the population.
Right. So some people have been proposing a variety of reforms, which I support. And you got a screen, I don't know if that comes up next or very soon, listing some reforms. Yeah. Can you mention these briefly? We're kind of tight on time. If you can just, like, people can even just read on the screen, or you can mention just a few of these, and then we move on, because I want people to understand the Greek democracy, and I want people to understand the origins in this country that had, do we want democracy or not? Can we tell us just a bit about this, and then we'll move on, and then move on to solutions?
Certainly. So there are many reforms that get bandied about that you'll hear about, like protecting voting rights, ending gerrymandering. Maybe we need more political parties, some people think. Or some think, let's go even bolder. Maybe we should abolish the Senate or abolish the Electoral College. These are all helpful reforms, but they really are just tinkering around the edge of the problem. And I went through all of these ideas myself, but I found that each one of them doesn't really get to the root of the problem. And so I went on an intellectual journey to discover what is the root of the problem. And what I found is a very exciting, bold solution, which is technically called sortition. But what it means is just this: replacing career politicians chosen by election with everyday people chosen by lottery. And it turns out, as crazy as that sounds, that this is in fact how democracy was originally practiced in the most famous democracy of all, ancient Athens. And so, as you said, we can transition to talk about ancient Athens. Athenian democracy lasted for several centuries. And a lot of us know that Athens was a democracy, but we don't think very much, we don't learn very much about how they actually function, how their democracy actually was instituted and operated. And so I want to talk a bit about how Athens ran their democracy. Athens was a very diverse place that was a population of some 300 to 400,000 people. And they lived in the city itself, and then the highlands, the backcountry, and then on the coast. And they were made up of various kinds of people. So it was a very diverse society. And for centuries, they were ruled by a monarch and then by an aristocracy. But eventually they transitioned to democracy. Now, the word democracy, which they invented, comes from two other words, demos and kratia. That means people and power. And by people, the Athenians really meant everyday citizens, the working people and the poor. Those were the people. And when it came to power, they really meant that power is the authority and ability to make political decisions for yourself. That was their definition of democracy, power of the people. We can give a more robust definition we can say democracy is the people's capacity to affect change through history, through joint action. More mature definition would be collective self-governance by a diverse body of citizens, limited by laws that are also established by the citizens. The Athenians believed there was three major kinds of political regimes, and they experienced all of them. So you have a democracy, which is power of the people, really citizen self-rule. You could have an aristocracy or a plutocracy where you have power in the hands of the best, or more often the rich. This is ruled by elites. And then you could have an autocracy where the power was vested in one person. That's a tyrant. And for each of these regimes, they believed there was a specific mechanism for choosing the rulers. So if you were a tyrant, you usually got power through a coup. If you were an elite, member of the aristocracy, the mechanism for an aristocracy and a plutocracy was election. So elections for the Athenians were the mechanism for an aristocracy, a plutocracy, not a democracy. If you wanted a democracy, you used lotteries. Lotteries were what guaranteed that everyday citizens, not elites, had the power to make decisions. Now, this comes as a shock to us, but it led to a very sophisticated political system in Athens. And here you have a diagram of their system of government. I won't go into the details, but in the center, those circles, the green circle were the citizens, the number of citizens in the population overall, which for them were the male citizens, the adult free males. And on the sides, you have the square, the rectangles are the different legislative bodies, judicial bodies, and administrative bodies. The magistrates, the juries, both civil, criminal, and legislative juries, and their executive council of their council of 500. Now, for almost all of these positions, both legislative, judicial, and executive, the people were chosen by lottery to fill those roles. Only a handful of positions, the generals, were chosen by election. Everything else was done through lotteries. And they combined the lotteries with mandatory rotation, a short term of office, very short, usually a year at the most. Juries were sometimes just a day long. And then a cap on your term limits. Most of the positions you could only serve one time. Some you could serve twice in your life, but not consecutively. You had to take a break. So what this led to was a high degree of participation in their government. They believed that a democracy was when citizens are ruled and can rule in turn, take turns ruling and being ruled by each other. Here is a diagram of the machine they built, a claritarian, which was a sophisticated machine that selected people at random to fill all of these positions. So here you see someone putting in the ballot, and the machine would turn out panels at random that would sort people into their duties for the day. And over time, this led to a high degree of participation. So over a 30-year period, a quarter to 1/3 of the citizens served for a year on the all-important Council of 500, or for a month on the executive board of that council. And nearly 70% of citizens served at least once in their lifetime on that council. And then when you include all of the juries, all the legislative juries, the judicial juries, and the magistrates, hundreds of magistracies, you had an overwhelming number of people participating. Some could even say, I was president of Athens for a day, because the presidency of the council rotated every 24 hours. So every 24 hours, you had a new person, a new citizen who could serve as president for that period of time. And they combined this system with a lot of forms of accountability, like annual scrutiny of performance by administrators. You could impeach people. They could strip people of their citizenship if they abused their office. And they kept perfecting the democracy over time. So you see at the bottom that in 462, they introduced payments for poor citizens to participate, to increase their opportunity to serve. And in 404 BC, about 100 years after the original democratic institution, they took more power away from the assembly and gave it to legislative councils, legislative juries. Now, Aristotle, the famous philosopher, he lived throughout this regime and he saw it in person. And in his famous text on politics, he remarks on this and he says that the appointment of magistrates by lot is democratical, while the election is oligarchical. In other words, if you want a democracy, you use lotteries, says Aristotle. If you want an oligarchy, if you want to be ruled by a tiny, wealthy few people, you should do election. And this led to the flourishing of Greek society, all the cultural achievements of ancient Greece that we still celebrate in philosophy, the arts, science, mathematics, the military, all kinds of achievements. They had this very radical democratic approach to politics, as Josiah Ober says in this quote, an expert in ancient Athens from Stanford University. Yes, so the question then becomes, do we have then a democracy in America? Now we have some examples from the colonial period and the First Nations period of face-to-face democracy from the Iroquois Confederacy and other First Nations peoples, and also the town meeting from New England. But the question is, what about our current form of government under the Constitution? There was a radical element to the American Revolution, especially from the writings of Thomas Paine, who really wanted a more democratic system. But when it came to passing a constitution for the nation in 1787, the framers of the Constitution, and this comes as a shock to us, did not want democracy. In fact, they despised democracy. The convention was led by 55 aristocrats, and you see here a number of things that they said about democracy. None of them were a fan. In fact, they thought democracy was the worst of all political evils. George Washington, our first president, said that mankind left to themselves are unfit for their own government. Hamilton, likewise, John Adams, likewise. They knew about the Athenian experiment, the Athenian model, but you see James Madison there didn't want the model from Athens. He had a very negative view, and he thought if every Athenian citizen had been the Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. They thought Athens was mob rule, tyranny of the majority. Their model was the Roman Republic, which used elections. They did not want an Athenian democracy. So we see that reflected in the Constitution. I won't go through all of these, but most historians and scholars can point to the many anti-democratic features of our Constitution. You have long terms of office, small numbers of representatives. You have a presidential veto, which is a vestige of monarchy. You have judicial review, which is basically judicial despotism. You have many, many points in the system that are where the majority, the will of the majority gets choked and throttled and stopped by minority influences. And by minority, they did not mean what we mean as minority. They meant the property owning class, the elites, could thwart the will of the majority, the common people, the everyday voters. And the root of all of this are elections. When you have elections, they just give us a limited choice between competing teams of elites. And they force us to outsource our power to the elites. And when they are in office, elected representatives respond more to the wishes of economic elites than to everyday people. And this was all on purpose. Madison and the other framers wanted to insulate the government from the will of everyday people. They wanted a plutocracy, and that's why they gave us elections.
And I remember a couple of years ago, I did a lot of reading on the origins of the Constitution and stuff. And the people who wrote the constitutions saw that in Europe, political parties were developing and they were just already very problematic. And the people who wrote our Constitution did not want political parties. They called them factions. That was the term they used, factions. But right after the government was created here, political parties arose, and we've been factionalized since. That contributes toward that elitism and that lack of representation. I'm downtown a lot, and there's homeless folks there. And every year Congress passes a budget that keeps poverty happening, but they fund the military lavishly. And these poor people, these homeless folks that are all over in our country, you know, if those homeless people gave millions of dollars to Congress in campaign contributions, those homeless people would be no longer homeless. Unfortunately, homeless people do not give millions of dollars to congressional candidates, and so poverty persists, homelessness exists. And that shows kind of the brokenness at a systemic level.
You're right, and the other problem is that our Constitution makes it very, very hard to fix these problems. Yeah. So Article 5, you see up there on the right, is the article that deals with how we amend the Constitution. It's we have the most difficult Constitution to amend of all of them in the world. To give you an idea, to pass amendment through the Congress, only 34 senators representing just 7% of the population can block a constitutional amendment, or 13 state legislatures that represent just 4% of the population can defeat a constitutional amendment. And in our history, there have been over 10,000 amendments proposed after the original Bill of Rights, but only 17 have ever been passed.
Yeah.
And the last real substantive amendments were in the 1970s when the voting age was lowered to 18. So we've had almost 50 years of no improvements. And as someone I heard put it well, you know, we tend to celebrate our Constitution for being the oldest that's existing right now. But would you feel really happy if your country practiced dentistry from the 1780s? Mm-hmm. Probably not. You would think that we should probably update our healthcare practices because we've made a lot of improvements in the last 250 years.
Well, we can't even get the Equal Rights Amendment. Women in the United States are constitutionally not equal to men, and we've been pushing hard for the constitutional amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, since the 70s, and it keeps getting blocked. But actually, the campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment goes back like a century back, was when they started pushing for it.
Right, and when you think about the fact that the original Constitution excluded lots of people from citizenship, so enslaved people were not full citizens.
Native Americans were not.
Right, First Nations peoples were not, and women also were excluded from national citizenship. It took really till the last 50 years to get full citizenship.
Can we move us ahead toward solutions? The American people actually are frustrated by all of this stuff, and people everywhere, worldwide, share a universal human need to be free and independent. This includes self-government, but in various countries, people are held back from self-government and are frustrated. But even in the United States, that's true. Let's see, what do you have here on the screen?
Well, right, so this
is different countries, yes.
The attitudes of people around the world to their political systems, and you see that we are right about tied for second for being the most willing to say that our system needs to be completely reformed or major changes. Only Italy is ahead of us when it comes to that. But you see a lot of these countries are what we say are liberal governments, Western governments, Spain, South Korea, Belgium. Some of these major liberal governments, we are seeing a lot of disillusionment. Others are doing better, like Sweden and Canada, but the US is near the top for disillusionment. So people are hungry for change. The question is, what change should we go for?
Can you move us into the concept of lotteries and citizen assemblies? We really need to put effort into the solutions.
Yes.
Because that's where I want us to be able to put most time in this interview. So, and we are running a bit late. So,
yeah. The proposal I want to make today to the audience is that we should embrace an exciting practice that's sweeping the world right now, and it's called citizens' assemblies. It's a new approach to democracy, but as you'll see, it's really more of a rebirth of the Athenian model for our time and our place. It's a process where everyone participates in in-depth policymaking, where expertise is both valued and questioned, where government is a tool we all use together. So this process of citizens' assemblies involves two major features. The first is democratic lotteries. The other is deliberation. So democratic lotteries, it's just what they sound like, a lottery where everyday people from all walks of life are selected to form an assembly, a representative body that truly looks like the people, the community at large. And they can be compensated for their time. And then the second phase, once they convene, the assembly goes through a very rigorous process of deliberation. They hear from panels of experts from a wide range of perspectives to give them information on the issues that they're going to be making decisions about. And then they work together to write policy proposals. So I want to break those down, those two steps. The lottery step is about who's in the room. So you see there's several phases to the lottery. There's an invitation that's mailed out to people, and especially people who've never participated before. And then using a selection of demographic factors, you can create a panel that's going to be truly representative of the population. And then you have your selection event, the actual democratic lottery, where a panel is chosen that represents all of the demographic targets. Once they convene, you have several phases of the deliberation process. You have the balanced group of experts and stakeholders who present to the panel on policy topics. The panelists then deliberate extensively about all the information they receive and the research they do. And they have facilitators, trained professional facilitators, help them to deliberate and really listen to each other, really try to understand each other and to find common ground. And then together, the citizens write a report that makes policy recommendations, and they deliver those to the government to make to the decision makers. And the whole process is aimed at trying to build consensus and find common ground and to think for the long term. There are a lot of principles that are at play. Inclusivity, bringing in new voices into the room that actually reflect the diversity of our society. Representation. This process guarantees that the many diversities that are in our communities are reflected in the room, especially point of view. There are many kinds of intelligences, and we want diversity. We want cognitive diversity. Many kinds of points of view and personalities can make for wiser decisions. Integrity. The process is transparent and research-based. It encourages collaboration, respect, civility, evidence, and facts. And it creates a sense of citizens feeling like they have a real authority over the process and that they can have actually a real influence in policy. So these are some of the many virtues of citizens' assemblies. It leads to a greater sense of trust in the government. It closes that gap we talked about between the decisions made by our legislative bodies and the people who are watching the process. It boosts diversity in civic participation and increases the access that different groups have to the process, especially those who have been marginalized in history. It most importantly, again, it promotes cooperation and the wisdom of crowds based on evidence. It's the idea that all of us together can, if you get a representative sample of people, they will come up with a solution that's more intelligent and thinks more in the long-term view than panels of experts and certainly career politicians. So it gives us, it taps into the untapped ideas and values of the community. Now, this has been happening, as I said, around the world. Since 2004, there's been a wave of these citizens' assemblies, and you see this reflected in the graph here. It began in British Columbia in 2004, and since then, there's been a huge explosion of these citizens' assemblies. And they've been taking place all around the world. You can see here many in Europe, but also Australia, and many in North America, Japan, etc.
Yeah, in Porto Alegre, Brazil, I remember reading years ago, they developed a very elaborate process of involving the general public of Porto Alegre, Brazil, in writing the municipal budget. The city budget was actually written by the people of that city.
Yes, so there's a great affinity between participatory budgeting and citizens' assemblies. The difference is here, the citizens' assemblies aren't just deciding how to use the budget, they're deciding what policy recommendations, what actual laws should we recommend about different policies. And those panels, those assemblies have addressed many areas. You can see to date, most of them have dealt with urban planning issues. The environment, climate change has been a huge topic for many of these assemblies, but also healthcare, infrastructure, public services, all the way on down. So they've been able to convene and address a wide array of policy questions. And while we haven't had as many of these in the United States, the idea of these assemblies is very popular. So you see here from Pew Research Center from 2 years ago, their survey, almost 80% of Americans, when asked, said it would be important for the national government to create citizens' assemblies where citizens can debate issues and make recommendations about the laws. There's a huge number, including 43% who said very important. And people say that if this was an option, that they would be very willing to participate. So here you see this graph, something like 75% of the public say that they would be more likely to participate in solving problems in the community if they knew that public officials would be there to listen to their recommendations. And likewise, if they knew that they could contribute their skills and experiences to solving the problem, and if they were invited in a respectful way. So that's a huge willingness on the part of the population to actually join in and take their turn at making decisions together if they knew that they would be listened to and that their skills and their experiences would be really valued in solving the problem. So that's very encouraging. So I want to talk briefly about a few case studies. The most famous and prominent example so far has been in Ireland. The Republic of Ireland has been using citizens' assemblies on the national level, not just the local, the national level, for over a decade now. Beginning in 2012, they had an assembly, 2/3 were citizens, 1/3 were politicians, and they addressed 8 issues, including marriage equality and the voting age and the presidential term length. And that was successful. They issued recommendations that led to changes. And in 2016, they came back, and this time the assembly was all citizens, 99 citizens from all walks of life. And they were given a mandate to address a number of issues, including reproductive rights and climate change and parliamentary reforms. And to give you an idea of how accurate they were, they gave a report that 64% voted for legalizing abortion And when the nation had a referendum the next year, 66% of the population, the voters, gave the same vote. They wanted to move to legalize and end the constitutional ban on women's reproductive health care. And so the assembly was almost exactly statistically accurate with the mood and the will of the people. These are some photos of the panelists, the experts who presented to the assembly. And you can see here, these are the small groups where the everyday people, the citizens, broke down to converse and talk about the information that they were receiving. Now, closer to home in Eugene, Oregon, just south of where you're sitting, Glenn, there was a citizens assembly a couple of years ago that dealt with housing code changes. They had 29 residents from Eugene who were selected by Democratic Lottery. It was a very contentious issue at the time. And they met online, since it was during the pandemic, and issued 4 reports that influenced the city code and made recommendations. Likewise, on a bigger scale, some people may have heard of this event that happened during the 2020 election. There was an event in Texas called America in One Room. And this was convened by a private group, but that through a democratic lottery, they chose over 500 citizens from all walks of life to convene and hear from experts about different issues relating to the election, and to break down and with facilitation, deliberate about those issues and try to come to some kind of common ground. And the results were very promising. You see that of 47 issues that they dealt with, 22 of the issues, the polarization, the level of polarization decreased significantly. So you see on the right here, on the issue of immigration, Republicans became much more moderate in their views and came to the center. And on the left, you see when it came to proposing a single-payer healthcare, Democrats moderated their views, but Republicans did as well. Some more of them came around to the idea. So people moved to the middle from where they were through this process. So the question then becomes, how can we take this from an idea to reality? And I have a quote here from President Lincoln, who said, what I want is to get done what the people desire to have done. And the question for me is how to find that out exactly. And so I'm here to say the good news for President Lincoln is that we now know how to find that out exactly. And the way to do it, to find out what the people want, is to move to a new paradigm. We need to move away from elections and voting and move towards democracy by lottery, where people are picked by lot to be representatives. Move away from elected legislatures and parliaments and towards citizen representatives and new institutions of deliberation. To move away from the electoral paradigm, which is all about polarization and conflict, and towards a true democratic model, which is built on broad consensus and finding the common ground.
When you and I were preparing for this, you mentioned that there are ways of extending these principles for other kinds of public purposes beyond governmental purposes. So that's good. And then also, whenever some good idea comes along and people want to implement it, we wonder, how do we accomplish this? How do we get from here to there? And I know that you've had some ideas about this, and we don't have time to explore that right now. But if you can have anything that I could share, oh yes, this is a good model. If you have anything that you can share with me, I can post this to my blog when I post the video to my blog. So anybody, even if they watch this on TV, they can still visit my blog and learn more about this and see the images that you've put up here that we've shared on the screen. And anything else you have about how to get from here to there for implementation, we can do. So I want to thank Nick Coccoma for sharing his information and his insights with us and his encouragement. I thank the people who've been watching this TV program. I always design my TV series to help people understand problems and to create bold solutions. And the American people really want better democracy, but the American people are frustrated that our current system falls short so severely. People want better solutions, and I hope people will consider what Nick Coccoma and some other people are proposing. Nick's not the only one proposing this, but this is very different from the status quo, and it challenges us to be bold and creative, to move ahead and to bring other people with us so we can build a grassroots movement for this. I like what Buckminster Fuller said many years ago. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So in light of today's topic, this tells me that reforming our current electoral system is not enough. We need to have a very bold, profound democracy through lotteries and citizens' assemblies to make our system function instead of being dysfunctional. Get rid of the obsolete system with a fresh new one. Years ago, I had a guest on a TV program who said that democracy really is only about 5% about voting. 95% of democracy is about grassroots organizing, my guest said, and I like that insight. And democracy is intrinsically best for human beings because only through democracy can we freely exercise our innate capacities and flourish. Real democracy will really make us happy. So you can watch, you can get information about a wide variety of issues about peace, social justice, and nonviolence through my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. Parallax has one R and two L's, parallaxperspectives.org. You can also phone me at 360-491-9093. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but all of us have to pitch in and help in whatever ways we can. The world needs what you have to offer. Thanks.